Right, in today's lesson, we're going to look at the common atmospheric pollutants and how human activities have led to an increase in pollution and how to decrease this pollution. So in the previous lesson, lesson 1 of this chapter, we did actually already look at the chemistry of the atmosphere and the greenhouse effect. So we have already done how the greenhouse effect works and talked about carbon dioxide and methane as greenhouse gases. Now, if you look at your specification, this topic is not very, as I say, pure chemistry as such. So it is not very difficult, but you just have to have an idea of it. So as you can see, this is what the student should be able to do. Should be able to evaluate evidence to report about global climate change. How to look at uncertainties in evidence. So for example, if the sample size is too small, or if there was not much evidence because it was a really long time ago. And also understand the peer review meaning. So peer review is when a paper is published, it gets checked by another scientific group. So they check if the results are valid by doing the experiment themselves. So that's what peer review means. So if we go to the nitty-gritty of it, understand how CO2 and methane have increased and how CO2 and methane are being formed by humans. So students should be able to recall 2 human activities that increase the amount of each of the greenhouse gases. So for CO2, burning more fossil fuels is one way. And methane would be farming. So cows eating more meat. Cows release methane when they fart. So those are the 2 main methods. If we look at this sheet here, which I will attach, we can look at all the pollutants and ways to reduce them and their problems. So if we start with CO2, CO2 comes from complete combustion of a fuel that contains carbon, usually a hydrocarbon, but does not have to be, as long as it has carbon. So CO2 is a greenhouse gas, so obviously the global warming is the problem with it, which then obviously leads to rising sea levels, extreme weather events, stuff like that, melting of the ice caps. So the way to reduce the problem is to simply burn less fossil fuels. So use less petrol and diesel cars, for example. Carbon monoxide is from incomplete combustion. It's a toxic gas that binds to hemoglobin, preventing oxygen being carried around the body. So to prevent it, you would need a good supply of oxygen. The next one here is carbon, which is carbon particulates. And it comes from, again, incomplete combustion if there's even less oxygen. And it causes global dimming. So that's when the sun's light doesn't quite get through all the carbon particulates, so it appears dimmer, like a lot of the time in London. And it can also blacken buildings. So again, to fix that, you ensure a good supply of oxygen. Then we have these unburned fuels as well. So not all the fuel burns, so it just comes out of the car. So that is harmful, and can be a greenhouse gas. Ensure correct fuel to air mixture. So make sure there's enough air to fuel ratio. That's not really much to worry about. These 2 are very common in exams. So SO2 and NOx, meaning NO1 or NO2. They both cause acid rain and are also respiratory irritants. So S forms from the combustion of S plus O2 makes SO2. I have talked about this in more detail in other parts of the course. So I'm not going to write all the equations, but nitrogen and oxygen react at a very high temperature. Those are the 2 marks as to how these form. You must say very high temperature. You cannot just say hot, because hot is subjective. So to prevent this, people use catalytic converters for the NO2. And for this one, there's something called desulfurization, when you remove the sulfur before you burn the fuel. So sulfur is just simply an impurity found in fuel. So if you remove the sulfur, you will not form SO2. So I will attach this sheet. If we go back to the course, based on peer-reviewed evidence, many scientists believe that human activities will cause the temperature of the Earth to increase and resulting global climate change. There's nothing that you need to actually do about that point. And lastly, the thing they want you to recognize is that evidence can sometimes be simplified. Sometimes they can take an extract of the evidence, and social media or the common news media can make very biased news headlines by using only part of the evidence because they want to construe what they want to construe. So you need to be careful. You need to look at how the Earth has always gone into these cycles, the Ice Age and so on, and really look at the evidence to support it. Where there are uncertainties in evidence would be if the sample size is too small, if it's a long time ago and people don't know, or perhaps they only looked at one country. It really depends on the actual question. So global climate change, an increase in average global temperature is the major cause of climate change. So that's what global warming is, an increase in the average global temperature. And you need to be able to know some of the potential effects of global climate change. So describe 4 potential effects of climate change. Well, let me bring up the notes. We've got the melting of ice caps, rising sea levels. Let me just get up the notes and show it to you here. Here we go, 4 consequences of climate change. Melting of ice caps causing rising in sea levels, flooding. The poor polar bear loses its habitat. Common extreme weather events, so getting storms increasing unexpectedly. Changes in rainfall may cause regions to get too much or too little water, which can affect the food in those regions and in turn the animals. Changes in temperature and amount of water available in a habitat can also lead to wild species losing their habitat or changing their habitat. Now, potential solutions. So that's what you need to understand. And then you need to also be able to reduce the carbon footprint. So how can you reduce your CO2 and methane emissions? Now, we already did talk about burning less fossil fuels and the cows. But you will see more reasons here. Also, it says, give reasons why actions may be limited. So that basically refers to the fact that everybody needs to cooperate, all the countries, because it's no good just the UK doing it when China has a much larger population and can contribute a lot more to the CO2 emissions. So I've actually already talked about this at the beginning of the lesson. Okay, describe how CO, soot or carbon particulates, sulfur dioxide and NO is produced. Okay, and predict the products of the combustion of a fuel. So I've already gone over this at the beginning when I showed you this table here. So review that. I've already talked about carbon monoxide in the alkanes lesson, and I've talked about it today. And we've talked about global dimming. So really the only thing left to do is this one here. So if we just look here, solutions. So to help tackle climate change, we agree that we need to reduce our greenhouse gases. So carbon footprint of a product is the total amount of CO2 involved with that product in its production, use, and disposal, and its obtaining of raw materials. So CO2 produced from burning fossil fuels can be pumped deep underground. So this is called CCS, carbon capture and storage. So you're preventing the CO2 going into the atmosphere. Methane from cattle or cows could be decreased if there was less demand for beef, so offer plant diet alternatives. Next, government could provide tax, which they do in London, depending on the age of your car and its CO2 emissions. So you have to buy a different vehicle. And you can also put a cap on how much CO2 factories can produce. Again, that requires international cooperation as well. Problems of reducing carbon footprint. So that's this bit here, why actions may be limited. So this is the last section of this. So reductions will have financial implications on the manufacturing and transport industries. Not all governments are prepared to reduce emissions, and it's hard to make everybody agree internationally. We had the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international agreement, but it wasn't ratified by places like USA, Afghanistan, Sudan, Andorra. Poorer countries were not originally included, so as they're not the main contributors. However, restrictions could hinder developing their industries. So while the UK was able to go through its industrial age and produce loads of CO2, if you stop undeveloped countries from doing that, you will also stop them from developing. Personally, you could use your car less and walk, use less electricity where possible, turn off the lights when you leave the house, and you can recycle your waste. So that brings an end to this lesson, and that brings an end to this particular chapter, because that is the final part of this chapter. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you for the final chapter of our series, which is using resources, chapter 10.